Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
Good afternoon. Joining us on the line now is Paul Wood, who has been fascinated by trees ever since he was a child. In his new book, Tree Hunting, he seeks out the best individual trees that grow in Britain and Ireland's towns, cities and villages. The book includes hundreds of unknown stories, including trees with hidden literary, scientific or political histories. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you, Hannah. Great to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. So can you remember where your love of trees came from, or when?
Well, I've been interested in trees ever since I was a child. And I think the thing that first fascinated me about trees was when I was, 12 perhaps. I remember noticing a beech seedling unfurling in our back garden where I lived, which is in the south coast of England. There was a wood behind all the houses. And so that was a great introduction. But it was noticing this seedling, which was a tiny, delicate thing, unfurling one spring and realizing that this would one day grow into a huge beech tree.
Yeah.
So that's what started me off, I think.
It's funny, isn't it? I think we have an interesting relationship with trees as humans because we walk past them every day and don't necessarily look at them all or marvel at them all. But yet when there's a story in the news that recent loss of the Sycamore Gap tree, everyone was up in arms about that, weren't they? And thought that
Absolutely.
was utterly horrendous. Yes.
I mean, I think I'm sure many other people were absolutely horrified by that. I think the sheer sort of unbelievability of why anybody would do such a thing, it seemed shocking. And I think also it was interesting how much people responded to that. So I felt like I wasn't alone in my love of trees. And in a way, what was, I think, one of the reasons why people were so able to latch onto that story was because the tree had a name, or rather the geographic area where the tree was, the Sycamore Gap. It was immediately a shorthand for that tree. And so what I've tried to do in tree hunting is name all the trees. So hopefully by naming them, people get to know them. Ultimately, they may be protected more in the future if people know about them and know where they are.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm going to ask you about some of them. There's one, the Fortingold Yew in Perthshire, the oldest tree in the UK or Ireland. Tell us about that.
Well, it's a fascinating old tree, that one. It grows in a tiny village in Perthshire, up in the Glen Lyon, and it's thought to be 5,000 years old, which is almost unbelievable.
Gosh.
When you see it, you might well believe it, actually, because what's happened over millennia is that it's split into a series of what you might think of as smaller trees. So yew trees are very much our oldest trees. You know, they're well known to live for thousands of years, and there are lots well over 1,000 years around, but this one's thought to be the oldest. It's got a very interesting story associated with it as well, in that in the Roman period, although Scotland wasn't a colony like England, there were Romans in Scotland, and an ambassador to the Celtic tribes up there was the father of Pontius Pilate. And it's thought or said that Pontius Pilate, as a child, played under the boughs of this tree.
Oh, wow. How amazing. Fantastic stories. And how do you know, or how do people know how old a tree is? I mean, I've heard, when a tree is, or when the trunk is cut and you can count the rings. Is that a myth, or is that true?
No, that's absolutely true. But when a tree becomes very, very old, it will develop hollows. So you can't do that any longer. For instance, the Fortingold Yew is now a sort of series of what you might think of as individual different trees that are all spread apart, but they are all the same tree. They're all genetically the same. So the you couldn't just cut one of those and find 5,000 years. It's about knowledge of other trees and how old trees are. And it varies between different species. So, for instance, yew trees certainly are the oldest trees. And as I say, they can live for thousands of years. But oak trees as well can live for 1,000 or so. And we know a lot more about oak trees and the ages that they can get because they've been documented over the years. So, for instance, one of the trees in the book, the major oak, which is quite a famous tree, which grows in the remnant of Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire, is thought to be about 1,000 years old. And there are other very old oak trees as well. For instance, in Richmond Park in West London, there's a tree called the Royal Oak, which is thought to be about 600 years old. And that has quite a hollow. So I guess that with oak trees, we know that trees that have been cut down that are about 200 to 300 years old are still intact. After that age, they start developing hollows, so you can't count the rings. So it's an imprecise science, I suppose, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. So are there people who can tell or can work out the age of a tree just by looking at it, without cutting it up and counting the rings?
Well, there are certainly people who have spent a lot of time looking at trees and understanding how they grow and how old they might become. And I think that certainly as someone that lives in a city myself, I look at plane trees, London planes being the tree that's everywhere in London. And you sort of begin to know roughly how old a London plane is by looking at it. So a lot of London planes we know were planted at the end of the 19th century. So the Thames Embankment, for instance, there's a plane tree along there that I call Bazalgette's plane that was planted in 1870. And I always think of that as a benchmark to understand if a tree is bigger or smaller than that, then roughly know whether it's older or younger. And talking of plane trees, the most fascinating one, to my mind, is one called Barney that grows in Barnes in West London. And it's the oldest plane tree in London. And that one we think was planted in about 1680. And if you actually go and see that, you'll be able to see how absolutely enormous it is compared to the 170-year-old tree on the embankment.
Wow, that's amazing. So like all plants and flowers and things there, you can get different varieties all around the world depending on the climate and things like that. Presumably it's the same with trees. Are there lots of trees that are native to the UK and Ireland, and then other trees that are native to America and Africa, etc.?
Yes, of course. And as you were saying, climate is the key to that. So trees that grow in tropical rainforests in Amazonia, for instance, are not going to be able to grow in the UK. And in fact, in the UK and Ireland, we have a very limited number of trees which are thought of as native. And that term is probably something which might need a little bit of unpacking. So native trees are ones that have been shown to have arrived here after the last ice age that weren't brought here by humans. So there's only 50 or 60 different species. But since maybe since the Romans, really, tree species have started arriving in Britain and Ireland from all over the world. So some of the first ones to arrive would be things like apple trees and mulberry trees, which came with the Romans, sweet chestnut trees. And then other species have arrived later. So something like the horse chestnut, for instance, a species that everybody's familiar with, actually originates from Albania. Other species that you might think of as being very, very common that don't come from Britain or Ireland are everywhere. Lots have arrived from North America, lots have arrived from Asia, and only a few from Africa. But there are some African trees because, of course, Africa has a very different climate to our own. But one that I immediately think of is the Atlas cedar. And Atlas cedars come from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. And that species is one which I particularly associate with Birmingham. So I've got Atlas cedars in Birmingham. Don't ask me why. There are lots of Atlas cedars in Birmingham, but there are.
There's also, is it Moseley Bog Oak in Birmingham, which is very significant?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful old tree. So that's an oak tree that's probably about 300 years old, grows in a nature reserve close to the city centre of Birmingham. This nature reserve is called Moseley Bog, and as the name suggests, it is a pretty boggy place. It's full of trees, though, and this one particular tree has been growing there, as I say, for 300 years or so. But like many places in Birmingham, they were the inspiration for Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, etc. So Tolkien grew up in Birmingham, and it's thought that a lot of the local sites inspired him. And Moseley Bog is allegedly Merk Wood. And I speculate that the Moseley Bog Oak, which is a wonderful character, is the original Ent from Lord of the Rings. Now, there are a few trees over the years that have claimed that title. There was one in Oxford Botanic Gardens, but the Moseley Bog Oak in Birmingham, I'm pretty convinced. If anybody goes to see that, it looks like an Ent to me.
And with regards to protecting our trees, for people who do care about looking after the trees and ensuring they're preserved for future generations, are there specific things that people can do to do that?
Well, trees have very little legal protection in Britain and Ireland. And as the Sycamore Gap tree or the case there showed, that the culprits there have been found guilty of criminal damage, but there's nothing which is particular to trees. And one of the things which I'm very keen for this book to do is to maybe ask the question, should we be protecting trees more, and do we need to think about having protections which are similar to protections we give to buildings? So in England, we have grade 1 and grade 2 listed buildings, and there are, very specific penalties for damaging those, and you have to seek permission and so on to do that. And I think we need something for heritage trees. So I think that would be a start, legal protection. But also I think it's down to communities to understand the trees that are around them and individuals. And again, I think that's what tree hunting is about. It lists 1,000 great trees that grow in places where people live, but I'm pretty sure there are thousands more that people notice, recognize, and so on. So what I would like is the book to inspire people to look out for their local trees, give them names. And I think by naming them and understanding what they are and so on, which species they are, how old they are, we start to gain knowledge of them, and we start to be able to give them personalities, and we start to be able to value them. And that, I think, is the key to communities protecting them. So if, for instance, there's yet another road widening scheme or a new car park being built and a tree is in the crosshairs, then perhaps if that tree is known by many people in that area, the developer may think twice about removing it. And, there are often ways in which trees can be accommodated into new developments. And I think there are several examples in the book where a great one that springs to my mind is the suburban sycamore in Bristol, which is not the sycamore, the suburban sequoia, which is a giant redwood left over from a Victorian country estate. And when that estate was redeveloped in the 1970s, it's now a sort of a state of cul-de-sacs, but the giant redwood is still there, towering over all these modernist houses.
Oh, lovely. And I love the idea of families going out and tree hunting with your book. You know, you've got maps and things, haven't you? So people can find these trees in their local areas.
Yes, there are 56 maps in the book. So they go from, the whole map of the whole of Britain and Ireland down to each region. So there are 18 chapters, and those are each regional areas within the main territory. And then there are 16 tree cities, and tree cities are ones which have 20 or more trees in them. And those are places like Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Dublin. And those are mapped. And then there are even towns, any town which has more than 5 trees in, I think it is, has a map as well. So there are maps of places like Dundee and Exeter, Bath, for instance. These are all places which have their own tree history and trees which I think are which people who read the book may want to go and find. And I think that what that shows is that pretty much every town can have some trees which are really, really significant to the people that live there.
Yeah. And how do you go about naming a tree?
Well, I should caveat that a little bit and say that I've named all these trees, but I don't necessarily think my names are the be all and end all. They're names which I think are my first attempt at naming them, but other people might have other names for them. So I'd be very happy to hear about those. Some trees already have names. So, for instance, Major Oak, the famous oak tree in Sherwood Forest, is one that had that name for hundreds of years and has been known by that name. But others, for instance, there's a great big fat plane tree that grows outside a pub in Carlisle that I've called Beer Belly, just because it looks so enormous and it grows outside a pub. So those are the types of things which I've considered when naming trees: is where do they grow? What are their characteristics? Do they have a story to tell? And that, I think, is the first step in naming trees. But then, that's sort of after having selected them as well, which is a whole other different way of thinking about them. But I'm sure that people have some good names.
Yeah, so they're not official names. They're just a bit of fun to give people a better connection to the tree.
Yes, although some, as I say, are ones which I've recorded already. I'll tell you an interesting story about a tree I went to see in Nottingham. So there's a wonderful old oak tree in Wallerton Park in Nottingham that I'd heard about and I'd read about, and it's 500 or 600 years old. It's enormous, wonderful tree, known as the arbor oak, and has been for decades and decades and decades. I went to find this tree. I discovered it. I was blown away by it. But when I was there was also a woman who was communing with it, and she was stroking the branches and so on. And I waited for her to finish her communing with the tree. And then I had a chat with her and asked her what she thought of the tree and so on. And she said that she'd known the tree all her life, and she'd grown up around the corner. She came to see it every week, and her daughter actually lived in Dubai, and she would FaceTime her daughter to with the tree in the background so her daughter could see how the tree was doing. But I said to her, "Oh, I know this tree's called the arbor oak," and she'd never heard that. And she called it, she told me, "I just call it the big tree." And I said, "Well, I've already got a big tree, and the big tree's in Kirkwall in the Orkney Islands. It's not as big as yours, but so I took the view that we couldn't have trees with the same name."
Oh, yes. No, I like that. It's amazing how trees can become so significant in people's lives like that. It's reminded me of, there was an olive tree that my husband and I literally got married under,
Wow.
very near where we live. And just recently, because the tree was getting smaller and smaller because they built a cocktail bar, a hut there. And I was ever so upset that the tree was getting smaller and smaller. We went there the other day and the tree's completely gone now. And I'm so upset because we could walk to the tree from our house. And as I say, it was pretty significant because we got married under it. But it's now a cocktail bar, so I guess we'll have to sit there and enjoy a cocktail and remember the tree.
Well, I think that's what you're highlighting there, is that people invest memories in trees as well, don't they? And I think, that also goes back to that notion of grief when trees are lost.
Definitely. And what do you think about tree hugging?
Well, I'm not a tree hugger myself, but many of my friends are. So I wouldn't have a bad word to say about tree hugging. I think it's something that if you're moved to do that, why not?
Fair enough. Well, if people want to get a copy of Tree Hunting, it's available now on our website, and it's by Paul Wood, who we've been chatting with today. I love how your surname is Wood and you knew about trees.
It's called nominative determinism, apparently.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for being with us, Paul.
Thank you, Hannah. Nice to talk to you.